This is Motocross Maniacs Advance, which is on, not surprisingly, the Game Boy Advance. However, the series actually has its roots back on the Famicom, where it started out sort of like Konami's answer to Nintendo's Excite Bike, although it's much less well known. The story of the game is that it's a racing game and doesn't have a story. Did you actually think there was going to be one? Racing game, no story. So the meat and potatoes of the game is, of course, the championship racing mode, where you are given about half a dozen different cups of varying difficulty, and over the course of these half a dozen cups, there's about 12 or so levels. Now the first neat thing about the gameplay is you get to pick your character. Yeah, there's a couple different characters. They all have their own unique stats, appearance, and voice clips. There are also two hidden characters you get for completing the harder cups, and they're a little wacky, but I unfortunately don't have any footage of them because the save battery in my cart actually died midway through recording, so, oops. Anyway, the game is basically a standard 2D racing game. Unlike the aforementioned previous game in this series, which was not dissimilar to Excite Bike, this is on a flat 2D plane with zero sense of depth. This means that your character's position in relation to other opponents is actually fairly unimportant, as you can drive straight through them. The tracks are very wacky and over the top. You'll find stuff like loop-de-loops just sort of suspended in the air. And a lot of the gameplay is focused more on using your boosts to get additional air off of inclines. Because each individual racetrack has several different paths of varying height. Generally the higher up ones that require you to conserve your boost and use it specifically to gain height generally have a lot more rewards. You'll find extra canisters of nitro for boost, and additional fuel which will keep your character in the game, because if you run out of fuel, it's an instant game over. There's also weapons, which are very odd. You can get stuff like missiles and mines, which, as I'm sure you probably know, can be used offensively, as well as a shield, but it feels like these were added as an afterthought. And while this works in certain racing games like RC Pro-Am or Mario Kart, it doesn't quite work as well here, because it actually does have a holdover from the old Excite Bike style games, of the fact that once your rider gets knocked off, they have to pick themselves up, get back on their bike, and then start accelerating. And because of this, it makes gameplay very stop and start. The weapons themselves are also kind of awkward to use. Like, the missiles, they end up feeling really broken. At least when the computer uses it. For some reason, when I tried to use them, they didn't work quite as well, but you could still really pull off some dirty stuff with them. And mines in general just don't make sense because you're ultimately going to create a hazard for yourself, because it is a flat field with no real way to avoid them. With perhaps the exception of taking an alternate route, which isn't always an option, or using your boost to jump over them, but I found that to be rather awkward. So yeah, weapons. Don't make a lot of sense here. Now the controls work well enough. Hold down the A button for gas, B for boost. You use the L button to deploy weapons, and you use the D-pad to position your character for jumps. So you can try and flip yourself for some style points, or, you know, try and angle yourself so you land comfortably. And I will also point out that these controls, while they work, and they work quite well, they don't translate terribly well to the Game Boy player. It's just the analog stick. Something about the analog stick it takes away from the precision of landing, and you end up landing straight on your head, pretty much every time. And for the most part, for the recording, I basically just stopped touching the control stick altogether and just kind of hope it worked. So if you're getting this, try and play it on either a Game Boy Advance or a DS. It works a lot better. The soundtrack to the game is not remotely memorable. I have zero recollection of any of the songs on here. There's some voice clips for each character when they get hit, when you select them on the menu. They're serviceable, but the sound effects for the most part sound very stock, and weirdly enough, the sound of the motor when you finish a race and your bike takes off, it sounds like someone is trying to make a makeshift duck call out of a blade of grass. It doesn't sound like a motocross engine at all, or like an engine period, and really just sounds like someone blowing into a kazoo. It really sounded weird. Now, the visual presentation in the game is outstanding. Each individual character looks different, they've got different portraits and stuff, that's cool. But what really stands out is the visual aesthetic of the stages. They all have tons and tons of detail, bright colors, nice contrast, and they have just so many nice little touches that makes each individual stage its own. I think the one that stuck with me the most was probably the Christmassy stage, which has all the blinky lights and a nice sunset in the background. It was just gorgeous. Top-notch visual quality all around for this game. In terms of replayability, this game it's alright. I mean, you've got 2 bonus characters which unlock after you complete all 6 of the cups. You have the ability to time attack every stage, as well as score attack, which gives you 3 laps to collect as many different point tokens from the various routes on the map. So you have to try and optimize your route so that you get to every single inch of the map to get everything. And that's cool for trying to discover the map and just see what the optimal route is, especially if you plan on taking on time attack later. There's also additional, what the game refers to as action modes, which are really just 3 sort of mini games. You've got one that is a game of hot potato with a bomb, and I think that idea has potential, but the map they give you is so freaking small that it really comes down to you passing the ball and then basically running up right behind the guy that you just passed and sort of waiting there and sticking right behind him, going very slow. And while it is strategic, I think they should have given you either more map selection or at the very least a much bigger map with alternate routes, because the one they give you is tiny and there's really one alternate route which is basically just above the other guys. It's not great. There's one that teaches you sort of the mechanics of using your turbo to jump on a flat plane, and while I think this would be a cool tutorial type stage to teach you the deeper mechanics of boosting, it kind of fell flat for me. It wasn't a lot of fun, and it was just tricky, and part of that's, again, because I was using an analog controller for recording, but it just wasn't fun. The timing on it was just a little off. I didn't enjoy it at all, to be honest. There's also some weird zombie score attack, which is basically you're given a lap to turbo through as many zombies, killing them all, and getting as many points as possible. It works, I guess, but it's basically just an extension of score attack on a very small single map. And I guess they just chose zombies because video games. Like the weapons, these additional action modes feel like they were an added afterthought, and it didn't feel like the game was designed with them in mind. But that said, if nothing else, they were a fun way to kill about half a minute each. And that's basically all there is to say about Motocross Maniacs Advance. In the end, it's a very average game. It's not wildly stellar, but there is some fun to be had. So if you see a copy at a flea market or something, you might want to pick it up, but I would seriously dissuade you from actively going out and searching for it, because it's not a wildly fantastic game. It's just kinda average, and I certainly would dissuade you from paying very much for it. I paid about $2.50 for my copy, and that feels like an accurate price for this game. It's fun, but it's not wildly polished, and there are many better games on the Game Boy Advance you could play than this. So, if you see it for cheap, pick it up, otherwise, skip it.